With this lesson, we begin another clause, which is support. Now, clause 7, of course, support, is divided into 5 other subclauses. The first one is 7.1, of course, resources. So the first subclause is resources, and resources is in turn divided into 6 other subclauses. The first one is, of course, general, just basically general talk about the other 5 subclauses. So basically, the organization is required to identify, determine, and define the required resources needed for establishing, designing, implementing, maintaining, and improving the quality management system. So what resources are we talking about? Well, these are the other 5 resources and the 5 other subclauses of the resources. So the first one is people. So we're going to talk about people. The second one is infrastructure, and then process, environment, and then monitoring and measuring resources, and then finally organizational knowledge. Of course, we're going to go through each one. We're going to go through one by one, starting with the next video or next lesson. So the first source that we're going to talk about is people. People or human resources or personnel, you name it. So the organization, according to the standard, so the organization is required to identify and provide human resources or personnel needed for effective implementation, operation, and control of the quality management system and its processes. So basically, the organization is required to identify its specific requirements for certain personnel. We're talking about regulatory and business requirements. So regulatory, again, is legal requirements, and business requirements. So people need to be competent. Now, the organization is also required to train its existing personnel and give them the best training. And also, when the organization outsources, in other words, hire external personnel, these personnel need to be competent. So it's pretty simple. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure that human resources are fulfilling the needs or the requirements in terms of competence and also the number of the personnel. This could be done by conducting interviews with personnel and top management, or simply by observing the personnel within the organization. The auditor needs to also review if there are any documents regarding the personnel. The auditor could take a look at the profiles of the personnel. Of course, the auditor could not review all of the profiles, so the headlights of each profile would be sufficient. The auditor could also ensure subcontractors are competent and trained. When we say subcontractors, we're talking about the people, the organization which the organization outsourced. The third type of resources, according to the standard, is infrastructure. So the organization is required to determine, provide, and maintain the environment necessary for the operation of its processes. We're talking about, of course, the processes of the organization, and to achieve conformity of products and services. Now, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about facilities or buildings. We're talking about information or communication technology. We're talking about transportation and equipment or maybe tools. Now, obviously, each organization has its own need of infrastructure. So this infrastructure should provide the organization with suitable conditions and accessories to perform processes and activities. As I said, each organization has its own need of infrastructure. So take the example of a healthcare organization that has, of course, it has a need of an emergency unit, insurance, pharmacy, physicians, and maybe fiber optic camera, and so on. So this is for a healthcare organization. As for an IT organization, the infrastructure contains server setup, software, networking, hardware, and maybe configuration. So as you can see, as I said, each organization has its own needs of infrastructure. Now, As for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to review documents regarding infrastructure if there are any, because no specific document is required according to the standard. Now, so as I said, if there are any documents regarding infrastructure, the auditor needs to take a look at those. The auditor needs to ensure that risks and opportunities related to infrastructure are identified, and the auditor needs to ensure that infrastructure is preserved or maintained. Take the example of skyscrapers in Japan, which are seismic isolated structures. So this is a system that is basically acts like a dumper or something. So it absorbs the shock waves caused by earthquakes to avoid catastrophes. The auditor needs to also ensure what kind of maintenance is performed, whether it's corrective or preventive. We're talking maintenance performed to the infrastructure, and who is responsible for that maintenance. The fourth subclause of resources is environment for the operation of processes. So basically, the organization is required to determine, provide, and maintain the environment necessary or needed for the operation of its processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. Now, when we talk about environment, we're talking about three types of environment. We're talking about social environment, psychological environment, and physical environment. So, physical environment basically is temperature. We're talking about temperature, heat, humidity, light, airflow, hygiene, or noise, of course, within the place or within the facility of the organization. Social environment is about basically the relationships between employees, so which should be based on non-discriminatory and calm relationship. So there should be communication, there should be helping, healing, education, and between employees. So employees have to treat each other with kindness and compassion. The third kind is psychological environment. Basically, the organization should be able to reduce stress of its employees and prevent burnout, and it should be emotionally protective so that employees can be more creative and have more or produce or be more productive. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to observe the environment. This observation is, of course, based on the context of the organization. So the organization has to provide an environment that is in line with its context. So the auditor needs to review or needs to observe that and, of course, takes notes. The auditor also needs to ensure health and security measures are taken. Take the example of the measures taken against the coronavirus in order to keep everyone safe. The auditor needs to also observe the physical factors, if physical factors are taken, and psychological factors, and of course social factors, which can be done by conducting interviews with employees to observe what social environment or social and psychological environment is of course provided. The fifth subclause of resources is monitoring and measuring resources. So according to the standard, the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed to ensure valid and reliable results when monitoring or measuring is used to verify the conformity of products and services to requirements. So basically, the organization needs to decide what tools it uses to measure business performance and whether these tools will give the organization everything they need as a result. Now, first of all, the organization needs to use suitable measuring tools, which is of course, or equipment, which is of course equipment that is used to test and commission systems such as multimeters, insulation testers, or maybe sound pressure level meters, etc. The organization has to also calibrate or verify. So basically, the equipment has to be calibrated or verified, or both. Now, calibration means comparing what the instrument shows versus a reference standard. The equipment also has to be identified. Identification can be done on the equipment itself or some document that we can use to trace the equipment. Also, the equipment has to be protected. It needs to be protected from damage or adjustments or anything that could change its calibration status, like, I don't know, vibration or shocks. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to take a look at those equipment, so equipment observation, and the auditor needs to also ensure these equipments are calibrated, verified, or both. Also, the auditor has to review the documented information regarding those equipments. And they also need to ensure that personnel know how to use these equipments properly, and so that they don't damage them or they don't mess with them. The sixth and last subclause of resources is organizational knowledge. Basically, the organization is required to determine, maintain, and make available the knowledge needed for the operation of its processes and to achieve the conformity of its products and services. The organization is also required to provide the knowledge needed when addressing changing needs and trends. Now, when we say knowledge, we're talking about basically information, like it could be information such as intellectual property and lessons learned. We can consider two types of knowledge or sources of knowledge, internal and external. So as for internal sources, we can name learning from failures and successful projects, documented knowledge and experience of others or of experts within the organization. As for external sources, we could name standards, academia, conferences, websites, gathering knowledge with customers or providers or anyone just involved with the organization. Let's take the example of an organization that wants to install a fire system. So it needs to ensure that it has identified what skills are needed for this kind of mission. So it will need maybe fire surveyors, engineers, and an understanding of the fire standards. Now, as for auditing this requirement, first of all, there is no document necessary or required for this requirement. So the auditor first needs to ensure that knowledge is provided to everyone within the organization, and how it's collected and managed, and how it's provided, the system that the organization uses to provide the necessary knowledge. And the auditor could take a look at documented information if there are any. As I said, there is no specific requirement, so if there are any documented information, the auditor could take a look at those. So we've seen the first subclause of clause 7, which is of course resources. Now, the second subclause is competence. Basically, the organization is required to determine the competence needed from persons doing work under its control that affects its quality performance. This could be done by looking at maybe job descriptions or manuals or contracts. Now, when we say competence is based on three things: education, training, or experience. So the organization shall ensure that these persons are competent on the basis of these three things. The organization is also required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. When we say documented information for competence, maybe we're talking about the personnel files or maybe the training records. The organization is also required, where applicable, to take actions to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. These actions may include provision of training to personnel and mentoring of personnel, or reassignment of current personnel, or maybe hiring or subcontracting competent persons. So we're talking about outsourcing here. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to review the documented information like diplomas, permits, certificates, authorization, resumes, training records, or licensing, anything that qualifies the persons to do the work. The auditor needs to also evaluate the training process, whether it's internal or an external training, and the methods used in that training, and also evaluate the mentoring and the reassignments of the personnel, and also evaluate the effectiveness of all that. The auditor needs to also evaluate the competence of outsourced personnel, of subcontractors, or the personnel belonging to subcontractors. The third subclause of clause 7 is awareness. So basically, the standard requires the organization or the persons within the organization, or the persons doing work under the organization's control to be aware of, first of all, the quality policy and the objectives relevant to that policy. And they should be aware of their contribution to the effectiveness of the quality management system, including the benefits of improved quality performance. They should also be aware of the implications of not conforming with the quality management system requirements. So basically, the organization needs to ensure that quality policy is read and understood by the persons working or doing work under the organization's control, and the person should understand the company's aim or the organization's goals and the company's processes in which they are involved, and of course their impact, their contribution, and that they should understand that they can have both positive and negative effects on the performance or the business in general of the organization. As for auditing this requirement, the auditor it must review documented information such as training records, and also the auditor needs to conduct interviews with personnel to evaluate, to see the level of awareness with the personnel and their roles and impact and their, of course, behavior within the organization. The fourth subclause of clause 7 is communication. Basically, the standard requires the organization to determine the internal and external communications relevant to the quality management system, including on what it will communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, and how to communicate. What does that mean? Well, basically, the organization is required to utilize existing communication channels, methods, and means. We're talking maybe emails, we're talking direct conversations, we're talking phones, and etc. Communication could be oral, written, or as a body language, and it could be formal, informal, or unofficial. The organization is also required to consider who will be responsible for general communication like website content or maybe general marketing, and also who will be responsible for specific communication like customer-client communication or product-specific literature and the relevant needs of the intended audience. It also needs to consider in-common communication. In other words, who will be responsible for receiving legal updates within the organization in making sure these updates are communicated to relevant people. Now, as stated, when we're talking about communication, we're talking about internal and external communication. To maintain internal communications, the personnel in the organization should be briefed or informed about new policies, about new or amended objectives and strategies and technology, about new clients, new products, and issues with suppliers, basically anything that will have an impact on them, an impact on the personnel. To maintain external communication, we're talking about allocation of key account managers and implementing review meetings. Now, for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to evaluate communications means like management-led communication in work areas, emails, intranet and website, and meetings. So the auditor needs to evaluate these means, needs to evaluate the channels, the methods, and the systems used in the communication in the organization. The auditor needs to also evaluate needs to ensure if the communication methods are fit for their purpose, and also the auditor could conduct interviews with personnel and top management to gain their perspective on the internal communication effectiveness or the effectiveness of the internal communication. The auditor could also examine the feedback mechanisms within the organization, like one-on-one interviews or maybe employee survey. The auditor could also review documented information like minutes of meetings that should contain items of internal communication. The fifth subclause of support is documented information, which in turn is divided into three other subclasses. The first one is a general talk. Basically, what the standard is talking about is that you could explain the system, but it would be easier, it would be far easier to write it down around your business and the business processes. Basically, the organization is required to keep documents that need to be maintained as documented information. And we've already talked about maintaining and the difference between maintaining a document and retaining a document. Maintain documented information means that they must be kept up to date. They could be revised or changed, like the quality policy or quality objectives. And also the organization is required to ensure or to keep records that need to be retained as documented information. And records must be kept as evidence that the organization has satisfied one particular requirement. So basically, to prove that it's working a quality management system, the organization have to evidence that. The second part is creating and updating those documents. So first of all, identification and description. The organization doesn't need to create a fancy system or a software. It just needs to ensure that documents related to the quality management system are easily identifiable. Like we could use like reference numbers and so on. The format, this is just to prevent anyone just using documents that they see fit. So like language and software version, graphics and media like paper, and whether it's physical or digital or electronic. And also they need to be reviewed and approved of. The third part is the control of those documented information. So it needs to be available to the right people. It needs to be available to everyone that they can see, and in a suitable format, and also protected from unintended alteration or destruction. The control of documented information is based on a few steps or a few systems. So distribution systems, access, retrieval and use, storage and preservation. So it makes sense to keep a record of all your quality management systems along with its current version and issue numbers. So, and also it would be better to ask when it was last updated and who's responsible for the content. And also you need a summary of any changes during revisions. So that's the control of changes, and maybe when it's next due for a review, and also retention and disposition. In other words, how long it must be retained for and how it is to be disposed of, taking into consideration, of course, the kind of information there or you're getting rid of, like personal information, for example. Now, as for auditing this requirement, the auditor needs to ensure that documented information required by the standard, like the quality policy, quality objective, and also the scope, are maintained, and also ensure that documented information necessary to ensure the effectiveness of a quality management system, like manuals, procedures, instruction, and so on, are also maintained. And also the auditor needs to ensure that documented information is properly created and updated, and also the auditor needs to ensure that these information are properly controlled. Now, one thing to note here is that this isn't a standalone action, and as we've seen before, how it's required, how the organization is required to keep documented information in many other requirements. So this isn't a standalone action. This is implemented in many other requirements.